And that has to do with, what is balance? What does balance look like? For most people, and this isn't 100% true for everyone, but I'm just trying to give you generalized information. My practice, we test to get more accuracy with this, but imagine this is your plate, and so what we're looking for is balance in your macronutrients. We're looking for equal caloric distribution from the micronutrients. I call it the rule of thirds because, again, none of this is imbalance. We're not saying eat, 70% carbs, 20% protein, 10% fat. What we're really saying is get an equal distribution of your calories from your fat, your proteins, and your carbohydrates on a regular daily basis without necessarily counting exactly. So this doesn't mean you got to get out a scale and measure absolutely everything you eat. I think that will create its own psychological problems for a lot of people. But seek for balance. Don't seek for imbalance. When we seek imbalance, we end up seeing problems. So look for the balance after you maybe have gone on a ketogenic diet, lost weight, recovered from carbohydrate toxicity. Basically, you've got to bring it back around to some semblance and some level of balance, lest you end up going too far in the other direction, because that does happen as well. So again, think of that as the overview. The benefit of the ketogenic diet, in my opinion, it has more to do with basically coming away from carbohydrate toxicity. And so people that are showing a lot of those benefits, it's because they're moving away from carbs more than necessarily because it's the ketogenic diet is such the healing diet. It's just a move away from a toxicity. So again, coming back to this. But again, I want to talk to you a little bit about, again, ketogenic diets for those of you who are trying to attempt them, kind of even in the short-term basis. What are some of the strategies involved and what you should know about ketogenic diets. So I want to talk about some of the big keto mistakes, these mistakes that people make. So let's talk about keto mistakes. And so those of you who have never heard of the ketogenic diet, I'm sorry, I didn't really define it, but a ketogenic diet is basically, it's a high-fat, low carbohydrate diet. Generally, the general overview or overrule is that a person doesn't receive more than 50 grams of carbohydrates in their diet on a daily basis. So that is, for most people, enough to get them into a state of ketosis. Ketones are byproducts of your body's ability to break down fat. So as your body is breaking down fat because it runs out of glucose, it begins to break down fat and create something called a ketone body, and it uses that ketone body to generate energy. Or to generate ATP, which helps your brain function, your liver function, your muscles function, etc. So again, that's the basis of a ketogenic diet is it's low carbohydrate, high fat. So let's talk about the mistakes that people make when they go ketone. So the biggest mistakes is, number one, is no transition period. If you have read anything about the ketone diet, you know there's something called the keto flu. And keto flu is a very real phenomena that occurs. It can cause a lot of fatigue. It can cause headaches, muscle aches, things of that nature, just like a flu can, because the person goes from here to here overnight. You don't want to make that shift that quick. You don't want to go carbohydrate toxicity, high fat, because what happens is slightly like shifting the gears of your car. So if you've ever had a 5-speed transmission where you had to actually shift the gear, not a manual or not an automatic transmission, you don't go from first gear to fifth gear, right, which is kind of what this is equivalent to. You go from first to second to third to fourth to fifth, and you make a smooth transition. So not transitioning properly in this keto arena is a big reason that people feel bad when they go keto. So if you've had a really bad experience with the ketogenic diet, it's probably because you went high carb to high fat overnight without any transition. So what does that transition look like? So again, I said earlier that a lot of people will get into keto under 50 grams of total carbohydrate in a day. That's an average. It's if you go from 300 grams of carbohydrate plus down to below 50, your body has to figure out a way to start converting fat into energy. And if your body's metabolism doesn't have that figured out, or if you have nutritional deficiencies, and many people here have tons of nutritional deficiencies that prevent their body from adequately and efficiently breaking fat down as a fuel to produce ketones, what ends up happening is there's this lull period that they feel really, really bad. So the one way that you can begin kind of your transition is not necessarily go keto overnight, but it's look at your macronutrients. Count your carbohydrate to fat to protein ratio. Look at them first. And let's just put in carb, fat, protein. Measure this first and see where you're at. So like I would recommend measuring it for 3 or 4 days so that you can get a chunk of data that says, okay, this is on average, this is what my meals, what my diet consists of. And so if you're a really high carbohydrate consumer, 60+% of your total calories coming every day from carbohydrate, don't go from 60% of your nutritional energy source to 5% or less. You might just look at reducing your carbohydrates by 20%. So take that 300 and take it down to 250 grams for a couple of days, and then take that down to 200 grams for a couple of days. And every couple of days, reduce your carbohydrate intake by about 50 grams until you can get under that 50-gram mark. That'll allow you to transition a lot more smoothly so that you avoid the major symptoms and side effects of that keto flu. So that's a big mistake people don't do. They go from 90 to nothing and they feel horrible over it, and then they think that the keto diet is not necessarily helpful or doesn't have any therapeutic benefit. They just think it hurt them. So again, it can be helpful and it can be used strategically. Number 2, biggest mistakes is consuming artificial sweeteners. Your body, I know what you've heard. You've heard from all the marketing hype that things like sucralose or Splenda and aspartame, they don't have calories, right? They're non-caloric sweeteners, and therefore you can eat as much as you want. You don't have to worry about gaining weight. The opposite is true. We actually now know that artificial sweeteners increase the risk for diabetes as much, if not more, than regular sugar. So if you're consuming a lot of these keto products, that's another mistake we could add to this list, is taking in a bunch of the garbage processed keto products that are being produced on the market that are full of stuff like artificial sweeteners. Like, you don't want that. You don't want those artificial sweeteners. They're going to impact your insulin. Remember, that's what carbohydrates do. Artificial sweeteners do it too. They'll raise your insulin. When your insulin goes up, there's a number of different side effects that happens that basically slows down your capacity to generate fat from energy. So you don't want to consume those artificial sweeteners or justify the use of those artificial sweeteners if you're trying to follow a ketogenic diet. The other one that I see, big mistake that people make on a ketogenic diet, is dairy. Now there's 2 components to this. Because a lot of you might be tripping out right now because you're smathering butter and dairy fat all over everything because it's a fat-free for all on the keto diet. Look, you can go on a keto diet and you can eat unhealthy fat. Like, that's a reality. And a lot of your processed dairy products, remember, where does that dairy come from? How is the cow fed? What kind of chemical ingredients or cocktails or genetically modified pesticide or herbicide or insecticide residues are in that milk that you're drinking or in that butter that you're buying? And a lot of you might say, well, I buy organic. Okay. Well, now we have to consider what the animal was fed, because if the cow was being fed largely grains that were genetically modified, or let's say an organic cow that was being fed organic grain, and now we look at the fatty acid composition of that milk. It's much higher in omega-6 fatty acids, which are much more inflammatory. So it does matter, because a lot of people go keto in an attempt to reduce inflammation. Remember, chronic degenerative diseases are inflammatory in nature, and the attempt to go from carbohydrate toxicity to a high-fat diet or a keto diet, the whole goal is to try to reduce the inflammation. So if you're just supplanting, if you're supplanting foods that are carbohydrate heavy with processed foods and unhealthy fat-containing foods, you're going to end up sabotaging your health and not getting anywhere. So dairy, one, the type of dairy matters. So if you're using dairy, again, it should be grass-fed, free-range. It should be, in my opinion, if you're looking at the dairy per se, it should be A2 homozygous milk if you're drinking cow or using cow dairy-based products, because A2 milk is protective of autoimmune disease. A1 milk is not. A1 milk has actually been shown in a number of research studies to contribute to autoimmune disease, which is, again, why a lot of people that stay on the dairy and their ketogenic diets don't tend to respond as favorably. But one of the other things about dairy is that dairy has hidden sugar. I mean, lactose, depending on, lactose is a carbohydrate, right? And so if you're using a lot of dairy, you could potentially, not be thinking about the carbohydrate that you're getting in from the dairy. So there's the quality of the dairy, and then there's the potential lactose that you might not be thinking about that can drive up the total glucose in your bloodstream. So dairy is a big one that you're going to want to stay, you're going to want to stay away from, in my opinion, if you're trying to heal from inflammation. Processed sugar is another one. Now, I know that a lot of you are saying, what do you mean processed sugar? More specifically, I'm talking about hidden processed sugar. So, things like bacon, and again, this is another mistake I see. People going keto think it's a free-for-all bacon fest. Like, that's a bad idea, especially if you're buying that regular store-bought bacon that is usually processed with sugar-based ingredients. A lot of your bacons are cured. A lot of your ham-based products are cured with sugars, and you can get a lot of hidden sugar in some of these products that are keto approved. Some of these meats that are keto approved. So read your label, read your ingredients closely, and make sure that you're ruling out any kind of hidden forms of sugar that might be there. Another failure that I see people make is in the stress of chronic measuring. So chronic measurement, if you're running around with ketone strips, to ensure that you're exactly where you should be, that in and of itself can create a chronic psychological stress that makes you more insulin resistant. So there's no, I would encourage you not to obsess over measuring everything, because it's in that obsession of measuring that I see people's stress levels go up, and then that it creates a problem. Number 6, it's too many calories. So again, a ketogenic diet shouldn't be too high in calories. You remember, calories are still calories. So a lot of people won't lose weight because it's a free-for-all on the fat. They're not really counting their calories, or they don't have any idea because they haven't really measured this at all, their macronutrients, and so they don't really know where they fall. So they're just over-consuming their total caloric load, and they're not exercising adequately, and so they're not losing weight because they're just eating more fat. Yes, they're no longer carbohydrate toxic, but it's not helping them because their caloric load is just way too high. And then the last thing on the list, number 7, is what I call pseudo food. So eating processed garbage. I mentioned this earlier. You're not going to get healthy. You might stop being carbohydrate toxic, but you're not going to get healthy. Remember, the goal of a ketogenic diet, it should be, the ultimate goal should be your health, right? But if you're eating all these processed junk foods that are keto approved, that's where I see people really, really struggle to really get this stuff under control, because you might be going from here to here, but realize that a high-fat, high-processed food diet is just as inflammatory as a high-carb, high-processed food diet. So you don't want to trade one processed food diet for another processed food diet and think that that's, somehow going to make you miraculously better off or more healthy just because it's keto. So again, these are the 7 big mistakes that I would encourage you not to make if you're looking at going into the ketogenic diet. The transition, so again, transition, and the best way to transition is first count and then reduce your carbohydrates by 50 grams every couple of days, and make a slow, smooth transition over here to avoid that keto flu. Avoid artificial sweeteners, really avoid dairy, particularly certain kinds of dairy. Avoid processed sugar. Chronic measuring can be a psychological burden on you, and then too many calories, and then eating pseudo food or fake food. All those are big mistakes that you want to try to avoid. So what is the goal here? Remember, going back to, what are you actually thinking about going keto for? There should be a reason that you're doing it. It shouldn't just be, I want to do it to try it. A lot of people have different goals. So some of those goals have to do with health. Some of those, and they should. I mean, ultimately, you should put, if you're thinking about this diet and health is not at the top of the list of the reasons that you're thinking about doing this, then you should just put it down and quit thinking about it. Health has to be the priority. because the diet, if it's not done in a healthy way, can make you very unhealthy. Note, it's no different than eating too many carbs of processed natures. Hey, and if you missed the earlier part of this series, click right here so you can go back and get caught up. The information there might be critical to helping you on your path to better health. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe for updates below. Have a great day.